In this video, I want to talk about cover crops. So currently it is mid-December and we are in the middle of a warm spell, which has been going on for the last few months. And I wanted to kind of take advantage of this time when the soil is still workable, it hasn't frozen solid yet, and I'm gonna try to plant some winter rye. According to some sources I've heard that this winter rye is actually able to germinate in cooler temperatures, and I'm going to try to see if it can actually germinate and grow, because unfortunately I didn't get a chance to get these seeds in the ground earlier in August or December, where these plants could have germinated then. But in this case, even if these plants do work, they do germinate, they do grow, those advantages have been delayed. So I did briefly mention about advantages of a cover crop. Like, why would you want to have a cover crop? Whether you are a farmer or a backyard gardener, it's still a good practice, and you can experience the benefits on whatever scale you may be doing this. So we want to use cover crops because we want to build and maintain soil, right? And specifically the life in that soil. When plants are growing, their roots for many of these plants are forming symbiotic relationships with a lot of the bacteria, the fungi, and other microbes in the soil. And specific types of microbes, right? Not all of them. There are some that are pathogenic. There are certain microbes that may be beneficial for certain plants and other microbes that would be better for other plants. And that's why you want to try to have as much of a diversity in a planting area as you possibly can. That way you have the fullest, the broadest spectrum of microbe life in the soil. And these microbes, of course, act as a sort of immune system for these plants, keeping pathogenic organisms out and away from the soil, away from those roots, so that these plants can work with the beneficial microbes. And the microbes work to make the minerals and nutrients available. Now, when the plants die off and fall, the microbes in many cases die with them, or at least they may go into a much more dormant state. While the microbial life in the soil can slow down in the winter, in many cases it has the capacity to continue to function, even though as temperatures get colder and they continue to drop. However, if all you have is a patch of bare ground and you didn't plant anything for the fall, nothing is coming up, in that case much of the microbial action does stop, particularly for the beneficial microbes that we are trying to encourage and maintain in our agricultural area. And so having a cover crop helps to provide a home and a food source for many of these microbes, where they can still form these symbiotic connections with these other plants. And this will carry over. And because of this, because you've maintained the soil microbial populations throughout the winter, then in the spring when you come to plant your cash crops or your garden plants, that way that soil is already to go. It is essentially pre-inoculated with those beneficial microbes, and that soil has also been able to become more aerated, right? There's much more ease of flow of oxygen and carbon dioxide and such between the soil and the air. And so it helps to prevent soil compaction, which can be a huge limiting factor when you're trying to grow particular crops, especially the annual dominant crops that we grow in agriculture today or in our backyard gardens. So these microbes that are in the soil need to be covered, right? You want to cover that soil. Any patch of bare ground that you anticipate to grow plants on needs to be covered. Otherwise it is open to the elements. It's essentially an open wound on the earth. There's no microbial populations to hold that carbon dioxide in the soil as a more stable form of carbon. And with any patch of bare land, that bare land has essentially no capacity to hold any meaningful amount of carbon, and that CO2 rockets up into the atmosphere. And also water vapor, right? The Barren land is much more severely exposed to various elements of flooding, of sun exposure, of wind. And that moisture just evaporates out of the ground, and so you lose that buffering effect. So in the wintertime, you want to have that nice sheltering blanket of a cover crop on top of your field or on top of your garden. We have to get out of that mindset of just tunneling in on our focus of getting a harvest, and instead we have to focus in on really taking care of that land and understanding that it's not a one-way relationship. There are systems that we have to take care of in order to continue to get what we need out of this landscape. Also of note, when you're planning to plant a cover crop, generally you want to really plant as much of a diversity of species that can act as a cover crop. And why is this? Like I said before, the more diversity of plants is equivalent to a greater diversity of microbes in the soil. Essentially, the more diversity you see above ground can act as a sign as to all the diversity that is going on below ground. However, in this case, I will just be planting rye, and this is partly because it's so late in the season, and in terms of the plants that I have available, I think the rye gives me the best opportunity to have some meaningful level of success. So this is more experimental in nature as opposed to being idealistic in a cover cropping scenario. So I figure I won't be planting all of the rye seeds in case this doesn't work, or it doesn't work in a way that would have justified using all of the rye seeds. So I'm going to be a little bit more conservative with the amount I use. I should also note that these seeds are about 2 to 3 years old. I'm not totally sure what the maximum extent of viability of certain types of rye seeds may be, but I guess I'm about to find out. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to dig a furrow right down this line. You'll see in the middle of this row I have some sunchokes planted, and this will be on the east side that I'll be planting these rye seeds. So that way, during the day, the rye will still be able to get more of the sun, especially as it warms up into springtime and the sunchokes begin to emerge. When the rye is sending up those longer stalks and beginning to go to flower and seed, that way it still has access to an ample amount of sunlight. So I'm interplanting it with the sunchokes since this had a little bit more disturbed soil. To harvest the sunchokes, I had to dig up the soil a little bit and disrupt it, and so to try to help revitalize it, I'll try to companion plant in some rye and see how that goes. It probably would have been more optimal to be planting the rye a couple of months earlier, but that way you still have some green growing plants that are able to fill that role to help keep the soil from being completely bare. And yet it will die down then once the sunchokes get larger, and when it's time to harvest the sunchokes, the rye should be completely gone by that point. That way you can kind of have a little bit more of a balance of constantly keeping something that's green on this type of a rotation. So cover crops essentially give us an opportunity to take into account a larger picture of what's going on in the garden, right? It's not just about growing a crop and then harvesting it and then waiting until winter, but gardening and the whole process, the natural ecosystem that you're interacting with is a 24/7, 365-day process. Just because you aren't necessarily gardening in the wintertime, depending on where you are on the globe, doesn't necessarily mean that nature closes up shop as well. And so the cover crops gives us an opportunity to really give back to the land of what we've taken in many ways, of continuing to not just taking the harvest that we want from it, but in giving back by giving these microbes, the soil life, these animals, a little bit more of shelter or food during the time of year when many of them need it most. However, it is important to consider that there's always more. Cover cropping doesn't necessarily give you the complete picture, the complete cycle, the complete system. Farmers will talk about, and I'm currently blanking on the specific term that it's called. Maybe it will pop up somewhere over here. But essentially on various farms, farmers will notice that when they go to harvest a crop, depending on the crop and associated species that are nearby, the edges of the field that are near a tree line or some sort of more wild or natural area like that, some type of transition area. These are the areas that can actually yield the largest, most productive plants, and in some cases can be even more productive than the other plants in the field, maybe more towards the center of that field. And also the animal browse may be greater on the edges as well in those areas, maybe yes, because it's convenient because those crops are right on the edge and they don't have to go deep into the field. But also they're probably the more nutritionally dense, healthiest crops, right? Because you have that tree line, you have that natural area, that transition area that houses these microbes, these fungi and bacteria that can infiltrate through to near the perimeter of that farm field and help to sustain some level of beneficial effect in terms of immunity and nutrients. Maybe sun exposure might be another variable. There are a bunch of variables, I'm sure, as to why it can be more productive on the edges than it is right in the middle. And I think that's might be a permaculture principle as well, of where you really focus on, you manipulate, you work with the edges. So I think that can shine some light onto a wider ecosystem that may be to our advantage to take into consideration when we want to have a highly productive plot of land. And we can find different and creative site-specific solutions to getting the most out of our land without having to abuse it in so many ways that we do currently these days. To me, this land is really focused on systems. It's not centered around one individual species exclusively, but we need all of them in order to continue to keep these systems, these cycles, to function throughout the landscape. Alright, so this video got a little deep, but if you're still listening, you have my sincerest gratitude. I know it's been a long season since I've put up a video, and I'm afraid that this one may have more than made up for it. But I hope that you've gotten something useful from it, and if nothing else, maybe you know, we can realize together that there's a lot more going on, or there has potential to be a lot more going on in an agricultural setting for optimum productivity, for optimum ecosystem health. That yes, you're taking food, you're taking resources, right, from this land, but what are you giving back? And what can you give back in your own life? Maybe it's planting a cover crop, starting up some type of compost bin. Maybe it's planting certain types of plants that maybe birds might like to nest in or eat berries off of. Or maybe it's even just something as simple as walking outside and just being thankful for what's available, for what's around you. And just try to maybe let the landscape kind of dictate how you give back, right? And understanding that different areas are going to have different requirements, different needs, based on the surrounding circumstances, the needs of that landscape, the climate, the temperature, many different things to take into consideration. Alright, so thank you for hanging out to the end of this video. I hope to see you in the next video. Hopefully it will not be quite as extraneous or intellectually deep, but I've been thinking about things. Alright, take care.